Good morning. Good morning to the Mind the Business That Pays You family. Today we have with us attorney Brian Fritz from, and you correct me if I'm wrong, attorney Fritz, I'm going to say Fritz and Brunelli. Is that correct? Is that the
Actually, yeah, I have a lot of practice helping people. It's Fritz and Beaton Cooley.
being Cooley? Okay. I said, I promise you I'm going to get that wrong when I get on here. So thanks for your help. So before we get going, I want you to answer one question for me. What is it like? What type of law? What do you do, and what makes you and your firm?
Well, thank you first for inviting me on. It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure I've gotten to know you over the course of the past few months, and I view this as a great experience and to further our working together. We handle general personal injury, and when I say that, we deal with a lot of catastrophic related things as well as things that are more associated typically with personal injury. What I feel makes us great at it is the fact that we do it differently. And when we started this firm, the reason why we did it, my partner and I, was the fact that we always felt the fact that our empathy always drove where we went with cases. What I mean by that is we always were invested in the person. And you can't tell these stories. You can't adequately describe the damages involved in a case like these, which are a lot of people think are the value driver. Well, that's part of it. You can't adequately do that and do the job that they hire you to do and what you promise to do unless you're actually to live in their shoes. And how do you do that? Well, you have to get to know them. You have to want to get to know them. And in a way, by doing that, our personalities and who we are makes us very, very intertwined with them. So what happens at the end of the day is when the case is resolved, yeah, there might be something to talk about in terms of a remarkable resolution. But the when you have a father come up to you and say, "Thank you for giving me my son back," or a
Wow.
client coming up to you and saying, "But for you getting me involved in that group of people with similar now disabilities that I have, I would have killed myself because I became important again." Those are the real paydays. And that's sort of how we view it as the right thing to do. And a lot of times we get involved and there isn't money to be had. But because of our fulfillment and our ability to help these people doing the right thing and being invested in them, that's more of a reward than a payday. And I think that's what makes us great at it.
I appreciate that. Now, you grew up in Philadelphia, and what made you want to become a lawyer who helps injured workers and families?
So I did grow up in Philadelphia. I grew up in the northeast section of the city. And how I typically answer that question is I provide the person asking the question two options.
Mhm.
One, do you want the real answer or do you want the BS one?
We want
And
the real answer, man. We
so,
need
the,
the
so
real
it
one.
was, in a weird way, the real answer at that time, being sort of I guess where a lot of, I'll call us kids at the age of 22, 23 years old, the driving things upon them was earning potential. And the fact that I thought I had a talent set that would excel in this, or at least I was told that by others, I chose that. And at that time, I also developed the BS answer, which was my personal statement to get into law school. And that started off with a wonderful, wonderful tale, and it just went from there. And then the shovel came out, and it just kept coming. Where it started off with, as Jimmy Carter's mother sat upon an African hilltop in the Peace Corps, she contemplated the meaning of life, and she came up with this: share yourself with others. And it just got more and more through there. And it talked about the altruistic benefit and the psychic income. But based upon my last answer, my first answer to you, in a weird way or naively, what has become the real answer as to the drive and what makes us special and what makes this rewarding. The BS answer is no longer BS. It's actually the one that's true.
I love it. I love it. So you grew into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
They say the best place to grow is in manure. So you kind of
Well, I'm a mushroom then.
let me ask you this: what does a catastrophic injury mean in everyday terms, and why are those cases different from smaller injury claims?
Sure. That's a great question. And really, the way to answer that is to go on the other side to the person injured. And
Mhm.
really, from their perspective, what is catastrophic? And, you know, it's a mix between the subject and the objective. And in most situations, it's where somebody's life as they knew it is no longer recognizable, where they're not able to work anymore in their chosen profession. And that could be from a herniated disc. And that's a certain level of catastrophic. And then you go through these different degrees. If someone's in a wheelchair, for instance, or someone has a brain injury and they need around the clock care, all right, well, there are different degrees of catastrophic versus something of a more modest nature, which, you never want to be somebody with a catastrophic injury because, you hear these people like, oh my God, I got a lawsuit, I'm going to get paid or something like that. You don't want to be one of those people, all right,
Right.
because no matter how much I get you, all right, after all the elation fades, you still go home to your couch with the same limitations and the same problems. You're not fixed. The only thing you do is have a bigger bank account, right? And maybe you're able to meet the challenges a little bit better, but you don't want to be somebody with a catastrophic injury. And maybe that's the best way to actually sum up a short answer to your question. But the more modest injuries are the people that have discomfort. They have issues now with maybe some disc herniations that they can grin and bear and they can make it through, but they can work and they can go on with their life, which someday may become catastrophic, where they are immobilized or through surgeries they have a worse result, which we have to plan for in the case. But immediately, what's before is like a broken arm or something like that that people, thank God, can recover from, or at least recover from, to live a more full life than someone who's in a wheelchair. Well, that would be the difference of degrees.
Understood. So we don't want to be in the catastrophic area because I hear you saying that, in which I totally agree with. It's all about quality of life, and money doesn't necessarily provide that. So let me ask you this, because I hear this term a lot, and I wonder if I fully understand what it means. What is product liability, and how can consumers tell if a product problem is a legal case?
Okay. So let me deal with that in the reverse order. If
Mm-hmm.
someone's injured by using something,
Mm-hmm.
okay, because of the specialization that goes into making a product and all the engineering, safety testing, specifications, requirements, and all those things, if you're hurt while you're using something, all right, and you have a question, don't debate about it or leave it to your own sort of analysis because you might have it dead wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And you should always go and ask somebody, first get your medical treatment, concentrate on your health, but then you should go ask somebody about it. Product liability derives from the concept that the people making these things, these products, are in the best position to make sure that they put things out there that are safe. In
Mhm,
fact, the law has evolved in such a way, doctor, that they have incentivized product manufacturers to make sure that their products are safe because they actually have eliminated certain defenses in civil litigation. For instance, if there's a car accident case or it's a slip and fall on a sidewalk, one of the defenses could be that the plaintiff, the person injured, attributed in some way to their injury. That's
mhm,
called contributory negligence. That has been eliminated as a defense in product liability. And they have created something called strict liability to try to help ensure that the product manufacturer, who's in the best position to make sure the product is safe before it goes out to market. One of the more pessimistic ways to view that is that the courts, through evolution, recognize that product manufacturers want to make money and that they might be inclined, unfortunately, or blinded by the drive for profits over safety. And let's take it for instance, because even though that's all supposed to happen, and people sometimes assume just because the product is out in the marketplace that it must be safe, that there's some sort of, regulatory angels out there checking all this. That's not the case. Let's go to something back from the 70s, and then we'll move up to more contemporaneous example. Remember those things? They're weighted on the end,
mhm.
and it seems like a bad idea, right? Where you throw them up in the air and you're supposed to use them sort of like bocce balls or horseshoes or something like that. Well, what was happening was children were almost trying to catch them like they were footballs. And next thing you know, they would pierce the eyeball with
Yeah,
such force and weight that suddenly you have a brain injury. So
yeah.
it didn't take long for them to be taken off the marketplace. Trampolines are still a very fertile area for this. And even if we go back to the early 2000s, product liability with the Ford Explorer and Firestone with the tires, right? You wouldn't think that these two big companies would put something out there. But there's a great book called Tragic Indifference. And in that, it's about how Firestone or Bridgestone, when they bought Firestone, they realized they got duped. So what did they start doing? They start reducing the amount of materials in their tires. Well, that becomes a problem when the tires are on the car and all the force is on that tire. Simultaneously, you had Ford trying to replace the Bronco too because it was so hazardous and prone to rollovers. They released the Ford Explorer. The problem was that the Ford Explorer had a very, very terrible rating for rollovers. So what did they do? They felt that if you deflated the tires a bit, that and they were only putting on Bridgestone, Firestone tires. Well, if you deflated the tires, it helped prevent against the rollover. Well, suddenly you had a perfect storm. You now had tires with less material in them being deflated on a car that had propensity to roll over. And once those tires were getting hot, they were coming apart. And then now you exacerbated the nature of the Explorer to roll. And it wasn't so much the roll, it was the roof crush and the windows blowing out because seatbelts keep you from going forward. They
Mhm.
don't keep you from going side to side. So suddenly people were being thrown out the windows.
Yeah.
So that's product liability. So whenever even the most innocuous thing, if they think or if they want to blame themselves, saying, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that," because that's our first inclination. You reach out to somebody because it may not be your fault.
Got it. Yeah, I
That's
remember.
a long-winded answer. Hopefully, it was informative.
No, very informative, and because I was putting myself back during that time because I remember that very well, so I appreciate that answer. So, when people, laymen like myself, hear the term medical malpractice, what kinds of mistakes are we talking about, and how hard is it to win a case like that?
Sure, that's a great question. Medical malpractice is one of the more challenging areas, right? And so let's deal with that. Let's take that in two ways. One, law school exam versus real life. And here's the difference. In a law school exam, you examine whether or not the person lived up to their standard of care. Okay. And if
Uh-huh.
they breached their standard of care, did they cause some damage, right? You check those four boxes. Yeah, you got a case of medical malpractice. Now let's go real world. Let's say the standard of care was breached and they didn't do what they're supposed to do. Well, then you have to start examining, okay, whether or not the person's condition can really be determined that that medical mistake led to a worsening, right? So let's say you have somebody who has stage 4 cancer and a doctor commits some error in judgment in treating that, right? But the person unfortunately was terminal. Well, how do you then argue that the doctor's malpractice contributed to hasten their demise? So that becomes a very gray area at times. So the problem becomes, what are the cases cost to bring? So you really have to have a case that's solid on all footing to bring those cases. Because if not, as an attorney, you're going to take a bath. And a lot of times, what we find, doctor, is that the motivating factor behind most medical malpractice cases, from the plaintiff's standpoint, is how they were treated. They feel that they were betrayed, number one, and then they were treated like jerks. And then that's what makes them seek out an attorney to see if something bad happened. In
Right.
the cases that are somewhat complex, but usually the ones that we can see in a much more clear way is unfortunately in the realm of birth injuries. Like cerebral palsy, a lot of times comes from a baby, a delay in delivery, not recognizing the distress, not doing a C-section earlier, and then you wind up with this deprivation of oxygen that leads to all these injuries with the baby. And then that becomes a little bit easier to define than some of these other situations.
Shifting gears a little bit because I wonder, I want to talk about case intake, decision making, and strategy. How do you decide? How does your firm decide whether to take a case, and what makes a case worth pursuing?
Sure. Okay, so a lot of times, a lot of our cases, we take every case with a fresh set of eyes. Some of the biggest results we've gotten are cases that were rejected by other firms.
Okay.
And that's the power of a second opinion. And we've handled a lot of those. So we take it with a fresh set of eyes. So when we determine whether or not there's a case, first we look at what are the factors or facts of the case. And a lot of times we find that cases are often rejected because people don't even take that first step or do it well. If there's a rush to judgment. Oftentimes the people evaluating these cases at other firms, their life doesn't change at all. They're younger associates. If they take a case that might be questionable or they might have to work harder at versus something more of a slam dunk. The only difference between the two is that they'll get recognition for the slam dunk sooner, whereas they have to work harder for the other one. But otherwise, their life doesn't change other than getting more work, right? So then it might be more inclined to reject that case. So we take with a fresh set of eyes. We look at the law. We make a determination based upon what's called negligence. If someone owed that person a duty, right, that they were supposed to do something, and then they failed to do it, they breached that duty. And then it can be defined that it causally created damage. So we will often find ourselves looking at things in a construction case or workplace accident case. We have to see whether or not somebody outside the employer relationship contributed or caused the accident, for example.
Mhm.
And they're often rejected because people don't delve into that situation and they just assume that it was the employer. We've often found times that there's people up the chain that made decisions or were involved in safety and they failed in that duty. So that's ultimately where we go in terms of looking at that complete factual background. And then we'll make a look at the damages because if suddenly in a case, be it a car accident case or be it something more significant, if we're going to wind up spending in costs that ultimately have to come out of the client's pocket because the cases don't cost the client anything. We front the cost because most people would never be able to afford to pay us by the hour. So we front all the cost and we get our fee and cost back at the end. But if we're going to spend $15,000 on $15,000 on a case and the case value is 1750, okay, so we got what 15,000 back and maybe we get a fee and we give the client a ham sandwich. That's completely irresponsible,
Right,
right? And
right.
I can't in good conscience ask somebody to invest 2 years of their lives and all the emotional, ups and downs and involvement on the basis of the idea that they might get something, but we'll get more. That to me is BS.
Yeah,
And I know there's other people out there that do it but we certainly don't. We explain that to clients if that's the situation. And we tell them, listen, somebody out there might have a difference of opinion. And you can seek them out. But that's sort of to give you a sense of how we go about looking at cases and then determining which ones to take. And also we have to factor in, doctor, whether or not there's going to be liability challenges within the law and whether we can overcome them.
understood. So you've won. I looked at your resume. You won some large settlements and verdicts. What are the main things? Is there a common like theme between what leads to big results?
I think there is. And so what we do, or what I do, is really just dig in and find out everything there is. One case we got, it was rejected, but I'll give you an example. The 27-year-old guy came to us, had lost both arms in an industrial accident where the machine energized while he was doing maintenance on it. He was gaslit and told that it was his fault. And they lied to OSHA, the OSHA investigators, and everything else. Well, he came to us after being rejected by two other firms because they either felt that it was going to be his fault or to the extent anybody was to be blamed, it was his employer. Well, we took that case. I looked at his paycheck, I looked at his W-2, and I saw a couple different companies' names on it. So that led me to then dig in through the resources and a process that I have developed that was able to flush out the fact that there was people above that were replicated in each descending level of the company making decisions. And that's what happens when you have private equity come into play. And we were
Mhm.
able to show that. Then further, what we did was I had basically investigators in 13 states going to around, and then I did requests to every fire department and every police department around any of their plants across the country to get all their police reports and everything else. And then I tracked down ex employees through them to get more information. We got every OSHA report that there was to get. We got in every state, all their incorporation documents. So we wound up having invested in that case, even with experts and everything else, $1 million that we never knew if we would get back. But we made a promise to the guy. One, we would get him answers, and two, we would do the best that we could. And the most rewarding thing on that was when we were able to come back and tell him through everything we looked at and how we developed it that they lied to him. It wasn't his fault. They were removing the safety devices on the machines to make more of the product that they made because they didn't want the transient Hispanic workforce to be able to turn off the machines. And he didn't know that. So that wasn't his fault. And he was able to turn that corner after that. So what we do is just with an utter and complete tenacity, go out and get every piece of information we can. And we usually wind up knowing more about the defendants in the case than they do themselves. And certainly their attorneys don't. It's usually coming out of left field and they're woefully underprepared.
Yeah, preparation key, like in a lot of fields. I know it is in law. Let me ask you this. How do expert witnesses like doctors or engineers affect the outcome of a case and when are they needed?
So those experts are needed whenever we need to carry our burden of proof. Okay. Because if something is beyond the layperson's knowledge, right? And it doesn't take much to get there to say that you pass a certain level. So we all know that you can slip on ice, right? So you don't need an expert for that. But you might need an expert to say what the flooring in a grocery store was such that it presented the right type of flooring for a walkway surface, right? So we usually need that. And what we do is whenever there's the whiff of the potential that we might need the expert, we'll go out and get it. Because otherwise, our theory might get bounced or get eliminated at the time of trial because we don't have the right support. So we usually, and the engineers are needed whenever there's a design issue. Sometimes the engineers will cover workplace safety issues depending on their background. But anytime it's outside the realm of a layperson, we need an expert. And we'll need doctors, either if there's medical malpractice involved, then we need doctors to comment on that, what the standard of care is, or when our damages are for future medical care, where somebody, and we have to support and say that the medical care received was appropriate and necessary, and then also talk about what's going to come in the future. And from that, their opinions, a life care planner comes in and projects future care costs.
Mhm.
And then we need an economist or a vocational, well, excuse me, sometimes a vocational person to say, here's their limitations and what they're suited for. And an economist to come in and say, well, here's the projected future lost wages. And that's the component of the case called damages. And that's when we typically need those people.
Got it, got it. Now I'm really, really interested in digging in here because I don't know if you recall, but when we met, I told you that my daughter
I do.
was going to law school, and I want to report to you that she's been accepted at 9 different schools.
That's great.
And so now she's going back and saying, "Okay, well, who's got the funds? Who
Yeah.
gave?"
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Mhm.
So we are enjoying that process. Let me talk to you a little bit about case process and timeline. Walk us through a typical case and what happens from the first phone call to your office to resolving the claim.
Sure. So, a lot of times people are very eager to know when will my case resolve, and depending on the severity of the injuries involved, right? We can always resolve a case tomorrow. And I used the term ham sandwich before, right? But
Mhm.
we could, but will that resolution be something that's fair to the client, right? After we get done with our cost and fees and everything like that. And the answer to that's going to be no. We may not be able to make that client happy, right?
Mhm.
And we'll make that determination early on. If it's not going to be a fruitful relationship between it, we'll have a conversation with them, and maybe they're better situated elsewhere. But what we'll do is we'll meet with the client, get the factual information. Now, depending on what the case involves, if it involves an auto accident where things go through the process of treatment and the person is, as good as they're going to get, then we can deal with the insurance companies. Well, that might settle within in a year. If it's something where the case I just talked to you about, where a gentleman's arms are amputated at the age of 27, well, that one's going to take a while, right? Because number one, usually the greater the severity of injuries, right, typically it's going to take longer, not only from our standpoint, but also from the defense or the insurance company's standpoint, because they're going to want to vet out everything. All right. They
Mhm.
have to check all these bureaucratic boxes before they start talking and discussing a reasonable amount for what you're dealing with. So a lot of it depends on how severe the injuries of the plaintiff are.
Understood. Now, slight variation. How long does a serious injury case take? And here's the part I want you to really zero in on. And what expenses should families expect while they're waiting?
So the expenses while they're waiting usually are derived from the lifestyle that they were leading before they ever got hurt. And then we usually monitor that because if there's ways that we might be able to direct them to seek out some level of help
Mhm.
to help alleviate some of those economic stressors. We certainly do the best that we can if we're able to do that. The serious cases, in terms of resolution, we usually try to once we have what we need, because you have to understand something. If a case comes in that's serious, like let's say it's a paralysis case where somebody has an amputation, and I put in suit tomorrow, right? Well, the clock starts ticking in terms of deadlines on me. And I may not necessarily have in place what I need or even have a forecast of what the future is going to hold for that person. So a lot of times, while the person's medical condition is being further defined in terms of permanency and what the future holds, we're working on all the factual liability stuff simultaneously so we can have an intersection of those and get the case into suit at that time. So usually once it's in the suit, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, there's a window called discovery. And depending on the complexity of the case, that's where interrogatories are exchanged. That's where all the evidence you gather for trial happens. And that's usually the longest part of the case. Sometimes it's abbreviated depending on the complexity of the case to a 6 month window. Sometimes it's a year. More complicated cases usually have 18 months.
Hmm.
And then you get these settlement conferences and pretrial conferences of the court. So in more complicated cases, if it runs the natural course and we're not aggressively, excuse me, if it's not being aggressively pursued, or there's naturally some things that have to work their way out in the case, well, then you might be looking at a 2-year window. Right now, we're involved in a case with 80 defendants and
Wow.
an 800-page complaint, and we're working through with all these defendants. And that case has been in suit since September, and we're still working things out with the complex web of defendants to move through the discovery phase.
Hmm. Hmm. I hear you now. Now, I just want to get a little bit of practical advice for injured people and families. What should an injured person do immediately after an accident to protect their health and their legal case?
Sure. Okay. So let's talk about the most important thing. All right. Number one, they have to seek medical attention. A
Hmm.
lot of people, oh, listen, none of us are immune from this.
Hmm.
It's a real pain to go to an emergency room, right?
Yeah.
It's a real pain to go to an urgent care center, right? But I always tell people, I'm like, listen, you go there, you'd rather be safe than sorry,
Yes.
and I use some real world examples of like Liam Neeson's wife when she had that fall on the skiing, and then
Hmm.
she went to bed, and here she died while she was asleep from her skull fracture.
Yeah.
And we've also had real world things with clients that had a back injury as a result of twisting their knee, and they were forced to keep working. Next thing you know, they find themselves in wheelchairs because their back was compromised. So you're better off knowing, right? So you focus on your long term health. All right, then we start looking at the lawsuit. Anything, even to protect yourself, or just even in the event that you're going to have to pursue the lawsuit, there should be as much as you can photographic evidence, collecting the information, witness information, as much as you can. You don't want to be giving out statements to insurance companies or to other people. And really, you should have legal counsel on that, because whatever we say initially
Hmm.
isn't evidence. Whatever you say can be used later on, right, as an admission. That's evidence. So most people may want to turn around and hope for the best. So suddenly you start seeing these reports. Dr. Holland tripped and fell. The ambulance showed up. He refused medical care because he said, "Oh, I'll be okay." Well, then 2 days later, you can't get up out of bed because you're not okay. Maybe you were embarrassed at that moment. Maybe you didn't want to bother anybody. Maybe you wanted to hope that you didn't need medical care. And if you didn't go, hope would become reality, right? Well, that's a problem, because then all of a sudden you have those statements down there. So those things shouldn't be said. Or an insurance adjuster who's not on your side,
Hmm.
suddenly taking all these notes down, right, which may or may not be accurate. So first things, medical care, photographic evidence, contact the lawyers for evidence preservation, such as a car or a product or something like that. Make sure that who compile, who may have been around, and you don't talk to anybody until you get legal advice.
Understood. Now, I'm a dig a little bit more on that because there was one piece that I want you to hit on. What are the most common mistakes people make after an accident that hurt their case? And I want to say these things. You mentioned recorded statements, seen doctor's visits, and then I want to say social media.
What's becoming more commonplace is the lapse of judgment when it comes to social media. The more immediate ones are the traditional ones, which are the first two that you mentioned: missing doctor's appointments and then giving recorded statements. They're always, problems. The recorded statements typically are more problematic than missing the doctor's appointments, because you may have a reasonable excuse as to
Hmm.
why you didn't go. But any sort of like ongoing lapse of continuing doctor's appointments, if you're defending the case, you're a guy with common sense and good judgment. Anybody that would, you would turn around and say, well, how hurt can you be if you're not going to the doctor, right? And that becomes a problem. So, if you can't get to the doctor, you got to make sure that you're supplying a reason why. And you make sure that's documented by the doctor's office. Recorded statements, they speak for themselves. And then the social media, there's a lot of dangers with that, even beyond which people automatically even realize. We had a case where the client, for whatever reason, I think he was an avid kayaker. Now he was paralyzed from the waist down. and he wasn't going kayaking again. Well, he posted something from years past. It came up in his memories. He put up on Facebook. What do you think we spent most of the case litigating about? There was no timestamp on that photo, right?
Right.
And then we've actually had, listen, you think your Facebook friend's a friend? Wait till you have a lawsuit and there's jealousy involved. We've had situations where a client was lured to a relative's wedding, and that relative worked for the same company, right? Got him to dance at the wedding, videotaped it, sent it into the company, and the company shot down his case,
Wow.
right? So you never know where the eyes are. So the better, less you put up there. And also the same thing too is your witty joke today may turn into such a bomb later, okay? Because perceptions change, inflections change, your sense of humor may not necessarily be shared by the world. So suddenly you have this very, very bad thing up there, okay, that maybe you shouldn't have shared.
Yeah.
Or even getting into certain views. Nowadays, people, for whatever reason, feel that their individual political views should be worn on their sleeve, and somehow it's almost like you're wearing your team colors. It's like you have the Sharks versus the Jets from West Side Story every day, and people keep putting it up there, and you don't know who your audience is going to be later on.
And I was just kidding, doesn't fly in court, I read.
Well, you know what? That might be what you go with, but when you see the jury start crossing their arms with that body, you're a guy on psychological body language, right? They start doing this, you're done. But you know what it does though? It gives the other side a great argument to mitigate the value of your case. We had one where it was a nurse who was injured by something in the operating room setting that limited his ability to really, and it was a very specialized field of nursing. And he talked about it and everything else. Well, the other side found a picture where he was in some lab or something, post accident, holding up I guess it was some sort of uh, whatever they were dissecting, a
Mhm.
heart, like this, like making some sort of, like, I guess, vulgar. I don't know what the hell the point of it was, but they put that up saying, "Well, how serious were you taking it if you're making these types of photos in the lab?" And that was a problem for us.
Right.
And we actually make people sign things when they first start, because everybody gets amnesia later, about, "Oh, you never told me that. I didn't know about that." So we make them sign something when they first sign up to say about the dangers of social media.
I got you. I got you. Let me ask you this: for families trying to cover bills while someone recovers from an accident, what practical resources or next steps do you recommend besides suing?
Okay. So what they have to look at is what's available to them. Now, the first line of defense in a workplace accident is workers' comp. Okay. But what we do is outside of work, we're a third party saying, after, like, outside your employee, or excuse me, employee, where, and the damages are different in our case. Our case are much more valuable than a comp case, which are very constrained by statute. So, but that's their first level of trying to make ends meet, is the workers' comp setting. All right. Then next would be looking at whether or not they have a potential Social Security disability claim to try to help make ends meet. Then is, are there any other short-term disability or long-term disability policies available to them? Whether or not, if there's a spouse involved and they have to care for an injured spouse, what their company's policy of FMLA might be to help them get through. And really, what you do is you hope that there's certain provisions there. Sometimes there's a governmental caretaker stipend that might be available, depending on the circumstances. And then sometimes, unfortunately, there may not necessarily be those provisions. And really, depending on um, different occupations out there that people are doing, sometimes you never think about tomorrow. And there's the option of, well, I don't want more coming out of my pocket now, so they don't elect the short term disability. But where we're able to get in front of those types of audiences where there's a high incident rate, we usually tell them that there's benefit packages available, plan ahead, and you'll be happy that you did.
Mhm.
Make sure that those things are in place.
I hear you. So I was talking to a gentleman the other day, and he was telling me that 70% of athletes who have multi-million dollar contracts end up going broke a few years after they get out of the league. And I bring that up because people feel like $1 million is a lot of money until that's all you have for the rest of your life. And so the question I have for you is, how do you help clients figure out a settlement, or if a settlement offer is fair, or if they should go to trial?
Sure. So when we sit down and we talk to people, we don't do it in a vacuum, right? We do it based upon the things that we've spoken about today, about the idiosyncrasies of each case, how badly the person's hurt, what are the damages in each case, what the likely result would be at trial in the event we had to go that way, based upon other cases that have preceded ours, either at settlement or trial, right? We get comps, like property comps. We'll do the same thing, and we'll look at them and we'll make an evaluation on that as to whether or not the offers are there to actually justify selling the case for reasonable value and eliminate the risk of a trial. Because you never know what 12 people in a jury box are going to do,
Right.
right? You don't know what the Eagles, the 11 people on the offensive side of the ball for the Eagles are going to run the right play, and they're getting paid how much. So you think the people in the jury box with 12 of them are going to, I mean, you can't bet on that, right?
Right. Right.
So what you try to do is you try to be reasonable and evaluate. You're always managing expectations, right? And then if there is a resolution, because also what's part of our responsibility, doctor, is if there is a resolution for a lot of money, a lot of people don't know how to handle that, and they might become the victims of friends' advice, hunches, or just preyed upon because they're nice people. So what we try to do is we introduce them to different financial instruments that are available and in place that can provide tax-free structured payouts over the course of time. Because that $1 million that you mentioned,
Hmm.
if it does what it's supposed to do and is measured out over the course of time, that's supposed to replace a lot of things, not just be some lottery ticket.
Right.
And what you try to do is put it in there so that they're able to reasonably handle it. Because if you start blowing through it, like you mentioned, the athletes, right? Tomorrow's never going to come. And there's a lot of short sightedness, and there's a lot of people around them, preying upon them, taking from them, and they don't have a lot of advisors. So what we try to do is really get the folks in a managed perspective so that it does do what it's supposed to do and keep them okay over the course of time.
Did I read it correctly that you have an OSHA certification?
Yes.
Well, I I have a undergraduate degree in building construction technology, and I also was OSHA certified. So when I read that, I was kind of surprised. But it shows your diligence. So how does your OSHA certification help you investigate workplace accidents, and why does that matter for a worker's claim?
Sure. So if you're more familiar with OSHA, we talked about the medical malpractice setting before, right? And I mentioned the standard of care. And the standard of care is whatever professional is supposed to come to the table and meet. That establishes their duty. That's the first step in negligence. So OSHA is a prescribed sort of standard of care of what general contractors and other construction people or workplace setting owners, whatever, are supposed to come to the table and meet. That's their standard of care. So a lot of times having an OSHA certificate and being more familiar with OSHA and more well versed in it allows us to know what they're supposed to be following, what they're supposed to be doing, and better able to work our way through a very large set of codes to see what could apply in that workplace setting. And part of the reason why we did that here, the OSHA certifications, our receptionist, or well, our client liaison at the front, Dana, she has an OSHA certification, 10-hour OSHA. She has more OSHA certification, safety training than most of the people we come across that have a responsibility in handling job sites. Okay. Right. So since we deal so much with OSHA and workplace safety, I wanted to make sure the people here were appropriately trained in it. And we apply that every time when we have to establish the standard of care and interrogate, question those charged with the responsibilities, and be able to draw out their shortcomings on the record. And that helps us with the discovery phase, with the liability phase, and ultimately working towards getting the case resolved to eliminate the risk of a trial.
Understood. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about your civic and public involvement. You serve on local nonprofits and professional boards. How does that civic work shape the way you practice law and help your clients?
So really, it's a natural extension of it, doctor. And what we do in those things and how we help those people is part of our, let's say, vocation of what we do as attorneys. Sort of that how that BS answer why I became a lawyer has now become more true than BS. Well, that compelling nature of that is why we get involved in those nonprofits, why we try to further and recognize the people involved, because of the fact that it's the right thing to do. And we often take on projects that we're never going to see a penny from because of the right thing to do. Right now, we're involved we took something on that I thought was where we are generationally was at risk of being forgotten. And I came across a story um, of a guy who was a witness in the case, and I learned that his dad, who was a World War II veteran, who had since passed, was involved in the liberation of one of the concentration camps. And he and his dad were on the boardwalk when he was a young boy, and a woman came from running from around the counter of this candy store, leaping onto his dad, hugging him, crying. And it turns out that that woman remembered his father because he's the one who carried her out of a concentration camp from Nazi Germany.
Wow.
So we're in the process of now going back and telling the veteran side of the story and locating that woman's family to tell her side of the story, because both sides of that are respective forms of courage on both sides that I think would be sorely needed in where we are right now as a society, to remember who we are and the evils out there and why we should work together to fight against them. So they're the types of things that we do because it's the right thing to do. And I think recognizing people through our Hall of Courage and really, paying tribute to them. For the people here, doctor, that work at this place, we bill ourselves as a different kind of law firm for the seriously injured. And that's sort of what we mean. We get an altruistic reward more than a financial reward. The the crazy results that we've crazy meaning in terms of amounts of money, not because they weren't deserved or they were by luck or chance. The crazy amounts that we talk about, 22 million, 25 million, 19 million, 10. These things are things that you can't get your arms around, these numbers. But that's not the real reward, as crazy as that might sound. The real reward is how you're able to make a difference. And that's the true achievement. And I think these things that you mentioned are a natural extension of that.
I want to know how do you keep yourself charged because you're heavily involved in the community, you're involved in your firm. What do you do for you that keeps you ready for to be with your family and keep yourself in good shape?
So with my, I guess, in terms of, I guess your question is going a work-life balance, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I don't have many hobbies, right? Where my hobby is how can I do better? And a lot of the things, and I also don't necessarily have a great sleep pattern. So where I get actually immersed in things like this example with the World War II veteran, and that's taken us through all different ways to research his combat history, the Holocaust survivor too. Those become my hobbies and become consuming to me, and that's sort of where my interests lie in doing those sorts of things. So what I try to do is, with friends and everything else, when those things come up, but at the same time, what drives you, it's hard. Maybe I'm not as good as other people might be, but that's sort of what makes me me. It does add to some strife at times and some sort of competition with things, and you try to balance it as best you can. My thing, and people say, well, it's work or you work, work, work. To me, it's not work. It's sort of like what makes me in this place what we are. And a lot of times, doctor, to tell you the truth, we gave our word, right? And that comes first. We gave our word, to a client or to whomever. Our hobbies, our free time, or at least mine, is secondary to fulfilling that obligation.
Understood. Let me ask you, Attorney Fritz, what have you most enjoyed about the time we've had to spend today together?
Actually, having somebody who's interested in hearing all this. And really, I think that your question is from the standpoint of really, getting into some things that the average people may hear but may not understand. It's a crazy thing about language, and I always go back to this: the simple saying, "The early bird gets the worm." Right? Nobody ever bothers examining that. They just keep regurgitating it, keep saying it over and over and over again. Nobody ever thinks like, well, what the hell makes it that you're going to be the bird? What if you're the worm? Right? No, there's one of these things that people just keep saying over and over again. They may hear these words and these ideas that you're talking about, and maybe they're not interested, or maybe they don't need to, or maybe they just feel back, or they just go with the flow in terms of hearing the terms without them being defined. So I enjoyed the opportunity to maybe shed some light on these things or demystify them to you, to your general audience here. And hopefully it helped.
It helped very much. I want to thank you so much for spending the time, taking the time. Attorney Brian Fritz, he's going to help me. I'm going to say from Fritz and
Me and Cooley.
Being Cooley, the law firm. And what's that phrase again? I looked at it. It's a different kind of law firm
For the seriously injured.
for the seriously injured. Listen, mind the business that pays you, family. This was just quality information, and we'll be getting it out to you in clips, and we'll get the full reel out. Attorney Fritz and his firm can be reached at www.fbesq.com. And we thank you for being with us today. Keep on smiling, keep on living, keep on loving, and we'll see you next time. Attorney Fritz, don't go away. We're going to say bye to our audience, but I have a few things I need to take care of with you. Thank you, everybody.